Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. The annual session of China's legislature from early to mid-March comes at a time of much global uncertainty, with tariff wars still looming and many countries considering putting up new barriers to Chinese imports, which have grown rapidly, particularly in areas such as new energy and electric vehicles. Against this backdrop, China's National People's Congress, or NPC, will approve China's next 5-year plan, which emphasises the government's ambition to promote what it calls higher quality growth and make China increasingly self-sufficient in new technology of all kinds, from AI to semiconductors. Yet with urban unemployment running at more than 5% and significantly higher among young people, and a property market still in the doldrums after a regulatory crackdown several years ago, the leadership's aim of boosting domestic consumption still faces challenges. Some hope has been pinned on President Xi Jinping's apparent rediscovery of enthusiasm for China's private sector, which creates the majority of the country's jobs. In 2025, he met with senior entrepreneurs, including Jack Ma of Alibaba, for the first time in many years. And before Chinese New Year last month, he held a meeting with a group of younger entrepreneurs in high-tech industries. China has also recently passed a new private economy promotion law. But will this be enough to stimulate the kind of economic revival the government is hoping for? To discuss this, we're joined by Andy Rothman, veteran economic analyst and former diplomat in China, founder of the consultancy Sinology LLC, and senior advisor to the DGA Albright Stonebridge Group. Well, Andy, welcome. We last spoke before China's legislative session this time last year. How much progress do you think the leadership has made in tackling the nation's economic challenges since then?
What I think we've seen since that time, and I think this is the most important thing for people following China right now, more important than what's happening between Washington and Beijing, and that's that recently Xi Jinping has made restoring consumption a political priority, not just an economic priority. And we can see this primarily through the speeches that he's been giving and the rhetoric he's been using. And now we're waiting to see how long that's going to take to happen. And I'm emphasizing not whether it's going to happen, but how long it's going to take. I would go back to the fall of 2024. Prior to that point, economic policy in China seemed to be drifting. There wasn't a clear sign that Xi Jinping understood how weak things were and the causes of that. But all of a sudden, in the fall of 2024, there was a change of rhetoric and a greater sense of urgency. And it sounded like when Xi Jinping was traveling around the country in the summer of 2024, a lot of local government officials talked to him about this. They really emphasized not the economic data, but the social stability consequences of a weaker economy. And that seemed to energize Xi Jinping to change direction. So Xi Jinping has been steadily ramping up his rhetoric about the importance of returning consumption to being the main driver of economic growth. And I think this is really important for people who are skeptical of whether this can happen, because I think people don't understand or have forgotten that prior to 2020, consumption was the main engine of growth in China. Consumption was almost 2/3 of GDP growth. Net exports, that's exports minus imports effectively, was only 1% of China's GDP growth. But between 2020 and 2025, the consumption share of growth fell from 64% to 48%. That allowed net exports, the trade part, to expand to 19% of growth. So what we're talking about is not a revolutionary change in the growth model in China. It's going back to where it was before. And the reason for that break in 2020, this is the other really important thing that's changed. Two things happened back then. One was obviously the COVID pandemic. But the other thing that was unique to China was that was really the beginning of Xi Jinping's regulatory crackdown, where he went after the property sector, a lot of different sectors in the economy: internet platforms, video gaming, electronic cigarettes, education, pharmaceuticals. And all of this added up to a real hit to confidence among Chinese entrepreneurs. And remember that entrepreneurs are important in China. Small privately owned companies account for 90% of urban employment in China. All the innovation, all the net new job creation, all the wealth creation comes from private companies. And these people, their confidence was rattled by this regulatory crackdown. And that led to a decline in private investment, hiring. That led to slower income growth, which led to slower consumer spending. But since the fall of 2024, there hasn't been another regulatory crackdown. That's Xi Jinping finally understanding that his policy pendulum swung too far to one extreme, and that is now gradually moving back in the other direction towards supporting entrepreneurs in the private sector and consumption.
The speeches which you quote Xi Jinping making in your most recent report for Sinology, he's saying we must accelerate efforts to address shortcomings in domestic demand, make domestic demand the main driving force and anchor for economic growth. And he also obviously, held these meetings with private entrepreneurs, including people like Jack Ma from Alibaba and Ant Financial last year. Do you think that this has translated into a greater confidence among entrepreneurs? I mean, obviously the government now and in the 5-year plan that they're going to approve at the National People's Congress are emphasizing innovation, and presumably some of that is still expected to be basically private. Well, clearly the government is also going to put a lot of money into this. But has there been anything like a real sea change over the last year, or is it a very incremental process to perhaps rebuild that confidence in that business community?
It's been incremental. And we can see this in a few ways. One is if you look at the Chinese government's own survey of consumer confidence, that consumer confidence metric completely collapsed during the Shanghai COVID lockdown. And it really hasn't recovered yet. It's still very weak. So I got to say, for those who don't trust any government statistics in China, it's worth taking a look at this because this is one of those sets of data, like, for example, the youth unemployment rate, where the numbers are terrible and the government is continuing to publish them. The consumer confidence number is still very, very weak, but it has been improving at the margins recently. The other thing that you can see improving at the margins recently is the purchasing price index for producer goods. So this is what companies are spending money on to make things. It's still very weak, but we've had 4 consecutive months now of month-on-month improvement, and that's the first time we've seen that in several years. So I think it's around the margins. It also depends a lot on which sectors you go to. So I spent a couple of days in Shenzhen in southern China in November meeting with companies in sectors like robotics and AI, and those guys are super happy because, as you noted, that's where the government has been putting its emphasis. But that's not enough. That's a relatively small but important part of the economy. So I think the rhetoric hasn't yet been a sea change. But the policy pendulum that I talked about before is slowly starting to move back in the right direction. And what I'm waiting for is to see what comes out of the legislative session in mid-March, whether there's going to be enough to accelerate that policy pendulum, or whether we're just going to have to continue to be super patient, and this is going to take time.
At the NPC session this month, they are going to obviously issue the government work report and then look ahead with this approval of the next 5-year plan. And that focuses on things like high quality growth and innovation, but also self-reliance and this sense that China wants to make more of its own high-tech goods for its own security reasons, as well as from the advantage that may give it globally. But the question for many people, as you mentioned, unemployment is, this kind of high-tech emphasis, is that going to translate into enough jobs for ordinary people? You mentioned, for example, youth unemployment, which has been, I think, estimated as somewhere around 16%. It's been up to 18%. That's, again, according to official figures over the last year or two. And many people are concerned that, the move towards AI, which China is now seen to be doing so well in, and more high-tech industry is inevitably going to create less jobs. How do they square this circle, as it were?
So let's address first the youth unemployment issue, which, as you noted, this is another statistic that's quite bad, but the government continues to publish. They're claiming, as you noted, it's about 16%. I think one of the reasons for this is that there's been a big mismatch between what young people are equipped for and the kinds of jobs they're looking for and what's become available. So since Xi Jinping took over as head of the party in 2012, the number of university graduates in China has risen by 81%. So there's a lot of people who have gone through the struggle of getting a university position graduated and can't find the kind of job that they think they're entitled to. But I don't think this is a big risk for social instability because this is China's elite. It's just going to take them time to find the right job.
These are the sort of educated young people who we hear described as lying flat because they don't want to go out and get a boring job. So they're waiting until they find something better or they're just giving up.
I don't think any of these people are giving up. I think that's a lot of Chinese kids who are recent graduates are now saying, I'd rather live in my parents' basement, rhetorically, than take a crappy job. And that's driving up the unemployment rate. But I also think the Chinese government is aware that simply focusing on robotics and AI and clean energy is not going to solve that problem.
They do seem to have talked about more vocational training for young people and making the education system more focused on the real needs of the economy now.
Sure, and that's not new. While the number of university graduates has gone up dramatically, it's still a small number. I think this year we're probably going to see about 12 million graduates from university in a country of 1.4 billion. So they do need to focus on the rest of the population that's not going to go to university. But I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the problem right now is simply about confidence, about sentiment, that entrepreneurs have lost confidence because of the regulatory crackdown. And given that the average urban consumer is either an entrepreneur herself or works for an entrepreneurial firm, that's led to a slowdown in consumption. That problem is only going to be solved by restoring confidence among the small businesses that drive the economy and create jobs. That will start this virtuous cycle of people investing in their own small business, hiring more. That will lead to an acceleration in wage growth. That is a longer term process. And I think that's what Xi Jinping is focused on, in addition to the innovation and technology part. But an interesting statistic that leaves me feeling optimistic about the ability of entrepreneurs to bounce back and consumers to bounce back is since the start of the pandemic and the regulatory crackdown in the beginning of 2020, household bank deposits in China have more than doubled. That's a net expansion equal to more than 12 trillion US dollars.
This is hedging against instability or anxiety about maybe poor job prospects and bad real estate situation.
It's all of those things. So the real estate market, which is where most urban Chinese have their wealth stored, has cratered. Wage growth has slowed, hiring has slowed. So people are spending less and saving more. But that's a huge increase in savings. Just that increase in the last 5 years is more than double the size of Japan's GDP. So when people's confidence comes back, they're not going to be waiting for a handout from the government, a big fiscal stimulus, or an increase in bank lending. They can just start drawing down on this excess savings. So I'm not talking about a quick reduction in the savings rate in China. That's going to take a very long time as they slowly, gradually continue to build up the social safety net. But this excess savings, this additional cautionary savings that have developed in the last 5 years, I think people will start drawing that down. We're starting to see a little bit of that going into the equity market in China because that's been outperforming over the last year. And I think people will start using that because also a lot of that household savings is small business savings, people who haven't bothered to set up a corporate bank account.
You mentioned the issue of welfare and how much the government is supporting people through this period. They have talked about increasing both vouchers, which is something they've used before to try and boost consumption, but also making some adjustments on pensions and subsidies for health insurance. These are in the 5-year plan. But do you think that these are going to go significantly far towards having an impact on confidence at a time when we've seen that wage growth has slowed and there have been reports of civil servants facing wage cuts, even people who in the past have been very protected from the buffeting of economic storms in the real world?
I think things like vouchers and subsidies for purchases are not important at all. All they do is bring forward a little bit of consumption. So maybe you buy a refrigerator this year because there's a subsidy instead of buying it next year, but you're only going to do that once. I think we're going to continue to see only very gradual increases in the social safety net, things like healthcare, education, retirements. It has been improving and it's going to continue to improve, but very, very slowly. So that's why I think sentiment is the most important thing. And that's a combination of people feeling like this regulatory crackdown, which stopped over the last year, isn't going to start again. And that's why the meetings, Xi Jinping talking to leading entrepreneurs like Jack Ma at Alibaba or the founder of DeepSeek, those are important signals. But it doesn't happen overnight. I think when I talk to entrepreneurs in China, they're saying, I want to wait a while and make sure that this regulatory crackdown is not coming back. So what is really important, I think, are both words and deeds from the leadership to get that confidence back. And it's not going to happen overnight. But also important to note that while you're right that income growth has slowed and this has led to slower spending growth, let's put this in context. So let's say between 2012 and 2019, consumption was growing in China at almost 8% a year. In recent years, that's slowed down, but it's slowed down to 5% per year. So it hasn't collapsed. That 5% growth rate in China is still significantly faster than the growth rate of consumption in the United States and Australia. Chinese people are still, for example, buying more automobiles than Americans right now.
To what extent is this continuing slump in China's real estate market a significant drag on the whole economy? We've seen that since that regulatory crackdown that you mentioned, house prices have fallen, construction has slowed by something like 3/4. New home sales have fallen by around 50% in terms of floor space over the last 5 years or so. And we've seen that, house prices in major cities fell again last month on average somewhere around 3%. And that's a little bit further down than the month before. So obviously, as you say, many people have a huge amount of their family savings really invested in their property. And for many people, that property's value has gone down over recent years. And we saw what happened in the US with the whole subprime issue in 2008. Obviously, China is different in some ways in terms of the structure of its property market, the way that people get their housing loans or mortgages. But to what extent is this still undermining efforts to really get the economy moving fast again?
That's a great question. And I agree that the weakness in the property market in China is by far the biggest factor in all of the problems that we've been talking about. It is the primary reason why everything has slowed down more sharply than it would have otherwise. Consumers are concerned, as you noted, because not only have property prices fallen, but the market is basically dead. So even if you wanted to sell, it would be really difficult right now. The slowdown in construction activity for new homes means a lot fewer jobs, especially for rural migrants who don't have the education to get into a tech job. It's led to a slowdown in demand for commodities. This has led to a slowdown in producer prices, which is contributing to deflationary pressure on the industrial side. So all across the board, this is the biggest single problem. I'm not expecting a dramatic policy announcement out of the legislative session in March. I don't get any sense on my visits to Beijing that there's a sense of urgency here. I think that the leadership seems to believe that the market has probably bottomed, the property market, and will eventually recover on its own with market forces. And so they would rather wait.
Do you think they're right about that? Obviously, the market did rise enormously in the previous decade, and some people might have thought it was overvalued. But do you feel that it's really reached its bottom now, as it were?
I think it's probable that the worst is behind us now in the property market. I think one of the reasons that the leadership in China doesn't feel it's urgent to do anything dramatic is that they also believe the worst is behind us. And the other factor that people keep raising with me is, okay, smart guy, give me the perfect solution to this from the government. They're worried, for example, that anything they do that would involve spending a lot of money, the waste, corruption, inefficiency by local governments as they implement this would be significant. So I'll be surprised. I'll be happy, but I'll be surprised if they announce something dramatic. But the other point I want to make is one that you alluded to, is the situation is very different from the housing crisis in the United States. Because even though this collapse in the property market in China has been underway now for almost 5 years, it hasn't had a spillover into a financial crisis like in the United States, because Chinese people have had to put a lot of cash down. For most of the houses that were sold in China since private housing was permitted, people put 30% cash down. If it was an investment property, they generally didn't have a mortgage at all. And that's quite different from what happened in the United States, where in the run up to the financial crisis, the housing crisis here, the median cash down payment for a new home, the median was 2% of the purchase price. I had 3 mortgages for properties when I lived in Shanghai, and the due diligence on the part of the Chinese banks that gave me my mortgages was way more intrusive and detailed than anything I've experienced in the United States. So that's why this hasn't spilled over into a financial crisis like we had in the US, and is not likely to do so. But until the majority of urban Chinese people feel like the market is starting to recover, that is going to continue to be a drag on consumption.
It's interesting that recently, I believe the Chinese government introduced restrictions on private companies publishing data on home sales and housing sales, which is perhaps a sign that they do feel the figures are still pretty alarming. We saw just in the last couple of weeks, actually, that the Shanghai government, for example, and Shanghai having been one of the places that's avoided perhaps the worst of this crisis in the last couple of years at least, that Shanghai has made it easier for people who have not been long-term Shanghai residents who come from other parts of China to buy properties, and now to buy not just one property, but even to buy a second home in Shanghai. Is that kind of measure, which, obviously we see these time and again from different local governments in China, does that help to boost this confidence you're talking about?
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially that this is coming in Shanghai. I don't think this on its own is going to turn around the property market in Shanghai or anywhere else. But what I'm curious about is, does this set of policy changes in Shanghai reflect a greater sense of urgency in the central government leadership in Beijing? And we're going to see more of this because, as you know, they like to experiment with these things, make policy changes in a few cities, see how it plays out. If it works well, they expand it to more cities and then the rest of the country. Are we starting to see a change in perception among the leadership that they need to do more to get the property market going again? I want to wait and see, but this is interesting.
From people that you talk to on your regular visits to China, do you get a sense of panic among, for example, homeowners who've seen the values of their properties fall significantly over recent years? I've met people who said, oh, my house price went down 40% in the last few years.
No, I wouldn't say panic, because very, very few people in China are underwater on their mortgages. Because up until a few years ago, the minimum cash down payment for a house was 30%. In the last few years, it's been 20%. So it's, as I said, it's not like in the United States where you could get away with putting almost no cash down. Also, banks' due diligence was quite significant. So if you really couldn't afford the mortgage payments, you probably didn't get a mortgage, unlike in the United States. Also, if you bought an investment property in China, it was really hard to get a mortgage, in most cases impossible. So most people I know in China who bought investment properties paid all cash. So they're not happy, but they're not in a panic because they're not going to lose their property.
But they may have lost some of the value of the cash that they put into it.
For sure. And as I said before, that is the number one factor behind slower investment growth and slower consumption growth. But that's different from panic. The only place I see panic in the property market are for people who put their 30% cash down for flats that weren't completed and still haven't been completed. And that's a problem that the government is addressing slowly. They seem to have some success with it because we no longer see protests about it, but that's a lingering problem that they need to do more to address.
So this is where developers basically ran out of money and were not able to finish construction of some of these enormous housing compounds that are all over China. That actually raises this question about the impact of the slowdown in the housing market on local governments, because, a lot of the money that Chinese local governments raised over the previous couple of decades until this crackdown was from land sales to developers, and the construction industry contributed a massive amount of tax and growth. So there is still this concern that local governments are in many cases struggling with their finances, that they've maybe made loans to some of these real estate companies who are not doing well, and there's still speculation that more of them could go bust. What do you think is likely to happen in that area in terms of both these companies, but particularly local government finances? And are they addressing those in the measures that we're likely to see coming out of the National People's Congress and in the 5-year plan?
No doubt that local government finances are in very bad shape all across China, in large part because, as you noted, financing was largely dependent on land sales, and land sales have almost completely ceased because of the collapse in the property market. Two things to keep in mind when you think about this. First is local governments in China are not like local governments in our countries. They're not independent political entities. Some people listening who might be old enough might remember when Gerald Ford said to New York City, effectively, drop dead, I'm not going to bail you out, when they had their own financial crisis. That isn't going to happen in China because local governments in China are effectively a branch office of the Communist Party headquarters in Beijing. Most of local government revenue actually is a transfer from the central government because the central government collects most of the taxes in China. Also, senior leaders in local governments are all appointed by the party. They're not elected by local people. So Beijing understands that if there were defaults or collapse, or if there's corruption at the local level, people are going to hold Beijing responsible. So they can't say, sorry, this is your problem. And the central government's really liquid. So we're not going to see defaults on a steady basis at local levels. The second thing is that this fiscal problem for local governments is going to lead Beijing eventually to completely change the tax structure, the financing structure for local governments, because there's a huge disparity between the revenue power that local governments have and the financing burdens they have for local services. That's going to take time, but in the meantime, I don't expect to see bankruptcies.
Is that related to, for example, things like consumption tax, VAT? I mean, there have been suggestions that much of that, which goes straight to the central government coffers at the moment, some of that could be given back to local governments to help them deal with the pressures they find. Is that the kind of discrepancy you're talking about?
Yes. But again, I don't think they've decided yet on how to make that work. There are always concerns about whether local governments can do this effectively, efficiently, and fairly. Are these officials properly trained and equipped to handle this new responsibility? My conversations with officials in Beijing lead me to believe they still haven't figured out what the ideal solution to this is yet. This is going to be a very long-term thing. But what I want to highlight is that in the short term, the central government has a lot of resources and is transferring those resources. There are temporary problems. I sometimes visit cities where I hear that teachers, firemen, police haven't been receiving their full wages because they're waiting for more money from Beijing. It eventually comes, but these are indicators that there are a lot of fiscal stresses at the local level.
And I mean, obviously, one area where there's been a lot of stress, you might say, both within China and in the impact it has internationally, is on issues relating to China's manufacturing capacity. Many people have accused China of overproduction and of dumping all kinds of products globally. And within China, there's been a lot of talk about this idea of involution, which basically is a sort of breakneck competition and race to the bottom. In other words, price cutting, like we saw with the electric vehicles in China last year, where the government brought many of the manufacturers together and told them you can't start selling cars for basically less than they cost to make. So do you think they're going to make progress in tackling these kind of issues? And what impact is this going to have on China internationally? We've just seen, for example, the visit of the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz to Beijing, and he appeared to feel that, he'd put relations between Germany and China back on track to some extent, but he said that overcapacity and overproduction is still a major concern for Germany and German manufacturers who've felt the brunt of it from the competition from China.
So let me try and break this down into two elements, domestic and the foreign impact. I would say that overcapacity in Chinese industry is a direct consequence of China's industrial policy. But I would also say that the burden of that overcapacity falls primarily on Chinese consumers and companies, significantly less so on foreigners. Why is it a creation of industrial policy? Because what the Chinese government has typically wanted to do, let's use EVs as an example, is not pick companies to support, but to identify sectors that it believes are important for driving growth in the future. So they picked electric vehicles a number of years ago. They provided a lot of incentives and political encouragement. This led to every major city and every province in China wanting to have its own EV producer. Banks were supporting this because the government wanted them to. Government supported it. There were subsidies. And it worked in the sense that China is now clearly the global leader in EVs. But one of the side consequences of this were there were too many companies that are not competitive. And also there's another problem, which is because there's government support here, it takes a lot longer for a failed company in China to go under. So if we talk about overcapacity, we have to make a distinction, I think, between, okay, there's a factory somewhere in China that could make 100,000 cars a year, but they're actually producing only 12. So yeah, that's a problem in some senses, but it's not as big a problem because they haven't closed, but they're not really operating. Because Chinese banks and local governments are disincentivized from forcing a company to shut down, and then they have to declare the loans as a loss. So this is always a medium-term cost to the Chinese economy. But the Chinese government, I think, has decided that this is a worthwhile expense to create champions in industries that they favor. So yeah, there's been overcapacity and there have been problems in solar, in wind, in EVs, in batteries, but China also has world-beating companies in all of those sectors. And so it just takes them time to deal with the consequences of that. But the cost of this is borne primarily by Chinese. Prices suffer. As I talked about before, you had industrial deflation for the last 3 years. I also noted that for the last 4 months, the month-on-month price index for producer prices is starting to improve for the first time in several years. And I think that is probably a result of the anti-involution policy from the government. But if we look at the overseas side of it, there's not dumping. That's a term that you mentioned, because that really means a company selling its product overseas for less than it costs to produce it. A year or two ago, I went to the BYD showroom in London and found that their electric car there was substantially more expensive than the same car was being sold for in China. So they're not dumping these cars. These cars are fantastic automobiles from a perspective of efficiency and just design.
We've also seen some Chinese government measures just in the last couple of months, which in theory will reduce the phenomenon of cars that are basically new being sold as used in Europe, to reduce some of the tariffs that people have had to pay to import them. And the government says it's cracking down on this. I don't know how effective this will be. We'll have to see, obviously.
Yeah, and in the last few years, if you look at policy announcements from the government, there hasn't been any export promotion policy launched. But there have been a number of policies launched to reduce export promotions, including VAT rebates and other subsidies. So on areas like EVs, I think this is just the strength of the companies rather than subsidies or dumping. There are other issues in areas like steel, for example, where you have private producers in China that just can't sell domestically because the property market has crashed, so there's no construction activity. And there you do have some companies that are willing to sell at a loss just because they don't want to shut down their blast furnace. And, that's a small share of Chinese production, but because Chinese production is so huge, it's having a big global impact. And those are areas where I think foreign governments, if they were more rational in their approach to China, could probably talk to them. But when the Chinese government hears foreign governments saying, we want to keep your EVs out because of your subsidies, well, most of those subsidies are gone. And even when there were subsidies, they were kind of on par with what the US government was providing for EV companies. It's a complicated issue. But if you look at the speeches that Xi Jinping's been making that we talked about before that emphasize consumption, the word export almost never appears in those speeches. He is not focused on promoting exports. He's focused on getting the growth engine back to where it was pre-2020, which was driven primarily by domestic demand, especially domestic consumption.
So do you expect to see the proportion of exports as a percentage of GDP growth falling significantly in the coming years? As you said earlier, it was quite low and it rose significantly in the past few years, even at a time, of course, when we see the pressure from, for example, the US with its tariffs and global concerns about Chinese exports.
Yeah, so first I would say that the US pressure from tariffs has been a non-issue for China. Xi Jinping is not at all worried about Donald Trump's tariffs, full stop. And that process that you talked about consumption coming back as a larger driver of Chinese economic growth, that's already underway. And I expect that process to accelerate.
There is talk both in the 5-year plan and more broadly about boosting the service sector. Are there particular areas which you think could develop significantly? I mean, there's been a lot of emphasis, it seems, on tourism and leisure, and we've seen all of these visa-free policies extended to most major international countries.
There's definitely a desire to boost services because services are an important job creator. The job growth and the majority of jobs are in services, and a lot of services jobs pay better than average manufacturing jobs, not all of them, obviously. So I think there is a desire to get services to become a larger part of the economy and a larger driver of employment growth. But I would still go back to what we've talked about. The most important thing that has to happen is a restoration of confidence among Chinese entrepreneurs who drive all the job creation, all the innovation, and all the wealth creation, which will then lead to a recovery in confidence among Chinese consumers.
And is there one single thing that you think the government could do or indeed say that would really contribute to that restoration of confidence? I remember when we spoke last year, you suggested that Xi Jinping maybe needed to make some kind of dramatic gesture like Deng Xiaoping when he went on his famous tour of southern China in the early 1990s after Tiananmen, when the economy had slumped so badly, and said, we've got to reform and we've got to move faster. What do you think could be done and what do you think will happen?
That remains my top suggestion for the leadership, not that they've asked me for one. I think that we will see more policies. I don't expect anything dramatic, but the one thing that would work and would not be expensive would be for Xi Jinping to use the bully pulpit of being the party chief, the way Deng Xiaoping did during his southern tour that you mentioned. He's done it a little bit. So he did meet with the entrepreneurs, and that was all over television. He has given speeches, and those have been published in Choushi, the party's leading theory journal. But, not a lot of people read Choushi, including in China. So, yeah, I think what would really work would be for Xi Jinping to be a little bit more like Deng Xiaoping in terms of how to persuade the public in China that this is where he wants things to go and that he will be taking those steps. But that's not his style. He's different from Deng.
He still does seem very focused on ideology. He's certainly still focused on his big anti-corruption campaign, which is more specifically in the Communist Party and certainly the military, as we've seen recently. But presumably that may also still make entrepreneurial type people anxious, that they feel that this social environment does not encourage sort of freewheeling economic enterprise.
I would describe it in slightly different terms. I wouldn't use the word ideology because I think to too many people that makes it sound like Xi Jinping is anti-capitalism or anti-markets or anti-entrepreneur, and I don't think that's the case. If you look at the data, the importance of private sector entrepreneurs in the Chinese economy has continued to grow during the period of time that Xi Jinping's been running the country. So I think it's not an ideological problem. It's a policy execution problem. These regulatory crackdowns, some of which have been focused on things like corruption, others have been focused on consumer protection or safety for students, they went too far and didn't work. And so I think what entrepreneurs are waiting for is a signal that this pause in regulatory crackdowns that we've seen over the last year is permanent.
We are getting suggestions that they are going to be scaling down the growth estimates for the economy, which has been at around 5% over recent years, that it might be something more like 4.5 to 5%. Do you see that as a positive sign that they're going to focus more on what they describe as this sort of higher quality growth? Or is it actually an admission that the whole economy is still going to take time to really revive?
Well, I think it's a number of things. One is just acknowledgement of the facts. The growth rate of the Chinese economy has been decelerating for a very, very long time. But that's okay. I have never met a Chinese official who says, I hope we can go back to 6 or 8 or 10% growth. One of the reasons is that would be impossible. The other is they understand the base effect, that 5 or 4.5% growth on the base of the Chinese economy, which is dramatically bigger than it was the last time growth was 10%, is huge. I mean, basically at 5% growth, they're expanding the economy by the size of Ireland's economy every year. And then the other thing I'd add is these growth targets are important for local officials, but I have never once heard a Chinese entrepreneur, a Chinese businessman in any sector say to me, oh, I wish the growth rate was higher for the GDP target for the government. Nobody pays any attention to that in the business community.
Well, Andy Rothman, thank you very much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thanks, Duncan.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find more information about SOAS China Institute events and read our latest blog articles on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.